Bristol for the weekend. But also, as an engineer, I never miss an opportunity to talk to medical students and doctors, just to double check that you're all aware that, of course, engineers save more lives than doctors. And in fact, if you don't believe me, the readers of the British Medical Journal were surveyed in 2007, and they were asked the question, what have been the most important developments in improvements in public health? And they all agreed in the number one position was water and sanitation. So things like antibiotics, vaccinations and so on are all useful, but actually if you want to improve well-being and save lives, you're going to call an engineer. So I'm going to talk to you this morning, first of all about the outcomes of a project that we ran in London. The Bloomsbury colleges in London got together ahead of the Sustainable Development Goals announcements, and to think about, well, it's great that we've got these specific goals, but how do they interact? Because we can see some positive and some negative interactions between all of these really comprehensive goals for improving sustainable development. So by the Bloomsbury colleges, I mean UCL, SOAS, the London School, Royal Veterinary College, and a few others were all kind of got together around the table, a whole bunch of people from all sorts of disciplines, including global health, biodiversity, energy, water and sanitation, which is my own area. So we're going to specifically talk, I'll show you those outcomes and how we conceptualised groupings of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we thought about those in terms of goals around the environment, being the outer layer, infrastructure goals, and then goals specifically related to perhaps what we're more comfortable with around issues around human wellbeing and health. And then I'm going to specifically talk to you more about sustainable infrastructure. As an engineer, that's the area that I'm most interested in. Infrastructure actually, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, presents perhaps some of the biggest challenges for being able to deliver health and wellbeing and human wellbeing without continuing to undermine our global support systems and our local ecosystems. So when we think about these interactions between Sustainable Development Goals, we can see that some of them are going to be positive. For instance, if you look at interactions between goals for health, goals for alleviating poverty, goals for education, if you do any of those, you're going to improve the other, most likely. Then there might be other goals around interactions between energy, water and food that perhaps are not quite so obvious. There might be some trade-offs there. So if we increase global nutrition by providing more food for people, that can actually require more water for irrigation, more energy for pumps for irrigation and so forth. And that can put pressure on our natural environment. Likewise, this kind of trade-off between, as some have seen, a trade-off between alleviating hunger, increasing agricultural productivity, and biodiversity. So what does that mean for natural ecosystems and land management? And the reason why we were interested in this whole exercise was partly to help governments to think about these kinds of interactions as they're going forth and thinking about how do we implement Sustainable Development Goals, how do we achieve these changes, and just to make sure that governments are aware of issues like, if you aim to achieve the goal for energy, improving access to reliable energy, without considering the climate change goal, then you might go for coal-fired power stations that require lots of water for cooling, and you may actually be undermining some of the other goals along the way. So this is a very hard to see version of one of the main outcomes of this work. I'll give you the reference at the end where you can download a report which has all of this detail in it. We also published it as a short comment in Lancet Global Health, and the reference to that is also at the end. But we essentially grouped these goals into these layers amongst each other, so concentric circles. So at the core, these are our wellbeing goals: health, education, alleviating poverty, all of these things that we can all kind of agree are good to do. Then there's infrastructure goals, all of the things we need to be able to achieve that. How do we actually get water, energy and food in there to be able to improve health, education and so on. And then, of course, on the outside, the goals for protecting the natural environment relating to biodiversity, land, the oceans and climate change. So a clearer version of that is that most of the first 5 goals relate to that kind of inner circle, along with reduced inequalities and peace and justice. Then most of the next round relate to infrastructure issues, and then these final goals relate most specifically to the global environment. So as I said, when we look at some of these goals, you can see the interactions within that first circle are mostly positive. The interactions where we get to the interactions across those boundaries, so between wellbeing and infrastructure, again, are generally kind of supportive. And the reason why we have most of our infrastructure systems, transport, water, etc., is to actually deliver human wellbeing. So that's a fairly uncontentious model of modern development. But where things start to get uncertain is where we think about those interactions across the 3 layers, and particularly the interactions between infrastructure goals and the bigger picture of the environment. So when we're then thinking about, well, what advice might we give to governments about how do you address these? The first thing to note was that most of those wellbeing goals are fairly well established. You might even say that that's kind of the reason why modern governments exist, to provide health, education, basic justice and peace to their societies. It's not to say that every government is doing that very well, but we kind of know how to solve those problems. Most governments will have a Department of Health, Department of Education and so forth. They need support to make it work, but there's not a lot of kind of new thinking really required there. Then thinking about the outer goals of the environment, things are really tricky there, particularly, we've seen around climate change, but it's not impossible to address. And there are kind of global structures in place to be able to come to global agreements and to have those then take action in national governments. And thankfully we have recently seen some success in climate change. But other conventional biodiversity and so forth are fairly well established. What's tricky though for governments is to actually think about infrastructure, because this is the area where the private sector becomes more involved. It's an area where experts, particularly engineers, are often left to make decisions. And historically that has always been assumed that those decisions are rational and are in the public interests. But with lots of investment and lots of private sector interest there, it's not necessarily always clear that that will be the case. And governments, particularly as infrastructure services have been privatised, it's really unclear how to manage those infrastructure goals in a way that will achieve sustainable development, rather than necessarily making profits for a lot of vested interests. Or perhaps as well as, but with a primary purpose being to achieve sustainable development. infrastructure. And infrastructure is effectively the things that mediate between the natural environment and human well-being. So most of us, just in our homes, want warmth, we want food, we want to be clean and safe. We don't necessarily want a sewage system, we don't necessarily want electricity or gas, we want all of the services that those provide. But we need to get from coal in the ground to electricity or lights in our house. And so we have these large engineering-led systems that we call infrastructure. So our conventional ways of operating as engineers is what we might call the predict and provide model. So conventionally, engineers, consumers or citizens demand water and electricity, populations grow, living standards increase, and engineers just keep expanding infrastructure systems, keep taking resources from the natural environment, keep pumping out pollution back into that natural environment to meet that demand. The challenge of sustainable development with that, looking at that circle of the environment around the outside, is that we can't keep doing that, it's not working, and we're not going to achieve sustainable development if we just persist with our same models of infrastructure provision. So the key challenge for us as engineers is to be able to deliver those human wellbeing goals without continuing to exploit the natural environment and to increase pollution. And particularly there's a challenge around carbon for that. So just briefly to give you some ideas of alternative models of infrastructure provision. The challenge of sanitation, I'm sure you're all aware, is massive. 2.5 billion people in the world don't have access to sanitation. Progress on this was appalling in the Millennium Development Goals. Things almost didn't move at all. And the reality is that most people in the world are not going to be able to get a nice washing toilet with a beautiful sewage treatment works at the end of a water-based sanitation system. So people have been coming up with alternatives, and on the one side we have an example from Durban in South Africa. That's a urine diverting toilet. So the urine runs out this pipe at the back, and in these two chambers goes the shit, which decomposes. It doesn't strictly compost. It's still unsafe when it needs to be dealt with at the end. But these are new alternatives to water-based sanitation. And the reason why, so this is in a peri-urban area outside Durban, and the municipality, the eThekwini municipality in Durban, actually drew a line, they call it the waterborne edge. They drew a line around Durban and said we don't have enough water or enough money to be able to connect everybody onto that, our traditional water-based sanitation system. So they moved to this urine diverting toilet system. The other alternative sanitation system is from Luwot. This was a company started by a student who did her MA at Imperial College and the Royal College for Arts. And she designed a system that, again, is, it takes human waste, puts it into a biodigester, you produce gas and fertiliser at the end of it. And they had a pilot study in Madagascar where they implement this. So this guy makes a living by people paying to use the toilet. They can then also pay to charge their mobile phones on the electricity that those toilets are producing. So these are alternative kind of technologies that then also need new business models and new governance models to support them. So I'm going to skip over that one. So yeah, just to sum up, part of the point of the work that we did in Bloomsbury was to really look at what are the interactions between these goals, and then to highlight to you the real importance of thinking about infrastructure as the kind of underpinning support mechanism for delivering human wellbeing without undermining the natural environment upon which we all depend. And those are the references. So Jeff Varga from the London Development, I'm not sure where he's from anyway, so I think. So Jeff ran the project with Chris Yap. So if you search Google them, this is all open access. We published it with Ubiquity Press and Open Access Press, so search for Ubiquity with Jeff and Chris's name, and likewise you can search for our article in Medsin Global Health. Thanks.